I'm responding to Sam Harris's Facebook post about the is ought problem. I think I can reconcile the problem he's having with other intellectuals in the public space. It's a hell of a goal for me to take on, especially as a nobody out there, for me to even make the claim to be capable of. But I've had this in mind ever since seeing his God debate with William Craig several years ago, and so I at least need to try. I could be wrong, certainly open to changing my mind to better reasoning. I'm going to entertain this crazy idea that somehow this video just might come to Sam's attention, and so I'm intending to address him directly. Dear Sam Harris. So it must seem haunting to be apparently living in a world of deranged moral relativists. How can these people not see that we're just trying to go in an obvious and measurable better direction? And if it's measurable, as we can measure a person's suffering or happiness, then how is it not objective? What's wrong with these people? Well, I happen to be one of these people that does believe that morality is subjective, and I think I can reconcile this mess for you. I believe, and I don't mean to say that I'm just going to change your mind. I actually believe there's some actual reconciliation to be done here, on both sides to just kind of patch this problem up a little bit. I believe the disagreement is at times purely a miscommunication, driven by a disagreement of terms. You alluded to this once in a podcast about the difference between ontological and epistemological morality, but I really want to hammer this out. It seems that we're still struggling with this given the whole conflict in the is ought Facebook post. So if you pictured a Burger King in your mind every time I use the word house, we would have one hell of a time getting through a debate on whether or not it's a good idea for me to buy a house and live in one. This seems to happen every time you get into a conversation on morality. I'll continue to clarify here. I need to start by introducing the idea of ambiguous symbology in the English language. This is something I witness humans failing on on a daily basis. So I'm a software engineer, and I have a fantastic analogy to try to introduce this idea. So in computer systems and devices that you're familiar with, they communicate with data to each other by passing just meaningless symbols back and forth to each other. There is literally no intrinsic meaning to a stream of 1,000 zeros and ones sent from one device to another. Yet, as long as they agree on what those zeros and ones symbolize, they can have a coherent conversation. Yeah, as long as 0010 means user, as in a user who logs into a system, then a device can say, hey, Sam is logging in, and he is a 0010. In other words, he's a user. But what if they somehow lost that agreement about the symbology? What if they were created with a slight difference there? What if, or even a great difference, what if the device said, hey Sam, or excuse me, hey, Sam is logging in, and he's a 0010, but the other device thinks that a 0010 is a credit card. Now that device creates a new credit card named Sam Harris instead of a user. And we've got a real conundrum here. In the real world, with computer devices, which are rigid and scrupulous, they would eventually realize this serious error and throw an error like an illegal state error or something. But in English, we've really got the same thing going on. Language is a constant goal of transmitting an idea or an image from one brain into another. So every word I'm saying right now has literally zero intrinsic meaning. It has as much intrinsic meaning as the 0010 did in the computer analogy. We've all just agreed on a convention so that as I say each word, you're creating the meaning from each word in your head. I'm literally moving information right from my head into yours at this very second, which is excellent. But humans aren't as thorough and scrupulous as the computers are, and we don't notice what I called before an illegal state error. We don't notice. And I mean, if it's dramatic enough, we'll notice. But as long as the ideas in our heads aren't dramatically out of alignment, we just go on chugging with the conversation as if they were identical. So let me demonstrate this. This will only take a second. I've got a picture in my head right now, and I'm going to try to move it into your head using only our language. Okay, it's a house. It's got one door and two windows. Boom. A moment ago, we didn't have that image shared with each other. Now we do. It's there. It's in your head. You're seeing it right now. Mission accomplished. We can now talk about the house. I can tell you that a car pulls up in the driveway. You could talk about whether or not you think the car should be in that driveway. But anyhow, here's the trick. Did you imagine a house with a lawn? Was there a roof? What color was the front door? Did it even have a color? Was the driveway asphalt or dirt? When I was imagining my house, for some reason I automatically imagined an asphalt driveway and a blue front door. And I imagined it was nighttime. There's always a difference between what we're seeing in our heads, and it matters more and more as we hit intellectual topics. I've heard you allude to this before as a bandwidth problem. But let me give you an example that really matters here, because we're starting to zero in on what I think you're hitting. So how about the word white supremacy? Some people, when hearing this word, imagine a rule set that allows white people to have an advantage or power. So anytime they hear white supremacy as a term, their brain paints this picture as just a descriptor for whether or not establishment allows white people to keep an advantage of power. Meanwhile, lots of other people, me for example, when I hear that term, I imagine something very different. I instantly envision bald heads and white robes and lynchings and like all the hatred that's on display in the American History X movie. These are really different things that are being brought to mind when that symbol comes up in conversation. So as you can imagine, I have a really difficult time agreeing with some people about whether or not any given thing is an example of white supremacy or not. We don't even agree on the word. We don't agree on the symbology. We don't agree on what exactly a 0010 is. If we simply avoided the term white supremacy altogether, we'd probably get through the discussion just fine and agree completely about whether a given scenario is simply one in which whites have an advantage and are maintaining power. But we don't do that as humans. We're constantly out of alignment like this. We don't realize that we're out of alignment. And not realizing that we disagree on the symbology and not on the question being asked itself. So because each participant in the conversation is asking themselves a completely different question in their head. So now let's take this idea of symbology, ambiguity, and look at Sam's conversations on morality. So Sam, I heard you say once, and I won't get this quote exactly, but you said something like, I think it was in your William Craig debate. I know I'm not getting this exactly right, but you said something like, as soon as you accept that what you're trying to do is find the best possible experience for everyone, it's all objective from there. Science can get you all the answers from there. I'm doing my best to represent you here as fairly as possible, Sam. And so hopefully I haven't wandered too. I'm pretty sure I got the essence. So here you defined morality as a goal to find the best possible existence for everyone. You and I would have a tough time agreeing whether something is moral or not, because this is not the definition of morality that I've come to know over the course of my life. In fact, I think your definition of morality is at odds with how most people define morality. But you don't know it, and they don't know it. That I can hear myself. That sounds a little cocky to say, but I just want to try to elaborate what I feel I'm seeing. If you and I were to simply have a discussion about whether or not finding the least possible suffering for humans is objective, we'd not only agree, but we'd get along for a long time in that discussion. We'd go a long ways. In fact, I think that's a relatively boring question. And the way in which everyone around you is defining morality is much more interesting. It's a different question. Yeah, even academically, morality is defined simply as whether conduct is simply proper or improper, or good or bad. Even academically, the definition doesn't give us a basis for deciding whether it's good or bad. Among both common laymen and accomplished academics around you, I believe morality is defined as the question of whether or not a behavior is good or bad. And basis for that decision is like an open slot, ready to be filled by whichever subject. So you, as a subject trying to decide what's right and wrong, filled that slot with the basis of how do we make everyone happy and alleviate suffering. Coincidentally, I did also, but only after 20 years of being a Catholic and filling that slot with how do I please God. You can see I kind of changed how I filled that slot. What were my parameters, or what was my basis? So now I can just hear you losing patience here, thinking about maybe stopping the recording. Oh, come on, Lance, that's ridiculous. Morality can't just be whatever you want it to be. And that's not the morality that any of us are really pursuing. People that I talk to understand that morality is the pursuance of happiness, etc., etc. And that's a fair response. But it's just, on the contrary, I do think the people you're talking to understand morality as I've described here, and that's exactly the heart of the disagreements. What word we use, be it morality or something else, is as meaningless as the 0010 that meant user or credit card in my earlier example. If you want to talk about how to pursue a world with the least amount of suffering, that's fine. But we're trying to scrutinize specifically how are individuals simply deciding that one thing is right and another thing not right. As you can see, the word morality could be used to ask both questions. The question you posed and the question I just posed, or whatever. And so it's only a liability. The word itself is just a hindrance to the discussion. It's not even useful. When you use the word morality, you're asking, how do we keep us all happy as possible? But perhaps your discussion partner asks themselves, how do we please God? Or maybe some nuanced version of how do we keep us all happy, or something. But there can be a big difference here, depending on how they filled in that little slot in the subjective definition of morality. But that's a big difference. Where's the illegal state error here? You two in the conversation aren't even on the same discussion topic. There needs to be an error thrown saying, hey, we're not in alignment. We need to get in alignment. So it's my sincere hope that if this recording reaches you, I'll have shined some light on one major problem in your discussions with others on morality. But unfortunately, we're not out of the woods yet. Even with the symbology ambiguity out of the way, I still think there's a genuine confusion on your part regarding the is-ought problem. I'm less optimistic that I'll persuade you on this final point. I mean, I'm open to changing my mind as well. But nevertheless, here's what I see going on between you and others. To help this, I'm going to draw up an example from my own essay on subjectivity. This example will seem sort of obvious and boring at first. Please just stick with me. I think I'll hit on the thing you're missing in the is-ought problem. Maybe I'm wrong, so no offense here. Okay, so for example, imagine person A insults person B badly. Person A and person B, they're both subjects in this exchange, right? They're both said to be subjective. Person C witnesses it. So in total, we've got 3 people. We might consider person C to be objective. Person A has called person B a racial slur. Just to really light the fires, let's say person A called person B the N-word. Person B is black, and they've been called the N-word here. Person B has a subjective perspective on that insult, having experienced the emotional pain, while person C is said to have an objective perspective. The slur wasn't aimed at them. They were able to consider the event without a biased experience of emotional pain. Person B may desire a harsh punishment for person A. Meanwhile, person C, being objective, lacking bias, might have a different feeling about what degree of punishment person A really deserves. However, is person C truly objective? How many times has person C been attacked with racial slurs in their own past? How many times have they attacked others with a racial slur and felt, it was just fine? Or how many related experiences might person C have to draw upon from just their wealth of time living on Earth that could sway their own opinion? Now here's the real trick. Here's the twist is, now you were also an observer as you envisioned this scenario in your head. And not only were persons A, B, and C present, but you were there as well, observing it as you imagined it. So now there are 4 perspectives, and you're one of them. How many times have you been attacked with racial slurs? When you envisioned this, and I said that the N-word was used, what was your emotional reaction? How did you feel that moment? How many times have you attacked others with racial slurs and felt it was just fine, or maybe regretted it? How many related experiences might you have to draw upon from your wealth of time on earth that could sway your opinion? So you are always at all times present and judging, and you cannot escape that. If you try to go one layer further out, you're still there. You're still present. You can try your best and actually do a very good job of ignoring your opinion and make some objective statements. But your ability to be not present and perfectly, absolutely unimpacted by your own experiences and existence, it should feel somewhat similar to the depths of a really successful transcendental meditation. You can't get all the way out. So here's my thesis, and I'll try to back it up. You're not aware that it's actually yourself watching and judging the hypothetical scenarios in the theater of your mind, and actually yourself generating those apparently objective ideas about what should be. So in your hypothetical scenario involving the stove, who's the one saying we should avoid sucky realities? The answer is you. The rest of the human population is extremely likely to agree with you, but the human population is not the universe or some objective reality. When a desire is very popular, even ubiquitously popular, it doesn't cross over into objectiveness. It is still a desire, and it's still subjective. If some grand coincidence resulted in every last one of us agreeing that sex before marriage is disappointing, or excellent, or that blue is the best color, if we all just by galactic coincidence agreed on these things, these questions wouldn't suddenly become objective. It would just be coincidence that we agree. Now, it's fairly obvious that science can measure happiness, at least to some degree, right? I mean, even if only by asking people whether they enjoyed something. Many experiences would be measured as much happier than others. That's objective. No dispute there. But should people want to be happy? Should they? Ought they to want to be happy? I believe so. And you believe so. But getting to that should required a you or an I. Does the universe think people should want to be happy? In a world without conscious minds, is there anything there that wants people to be happy? You must still be a subject, and you must be a conscious mind in the universe in order to want that happiness for others. Maybe it sounds scary or delusional on its face, but it's an ontological truth here about where things exist, whether we have the courage to admit it or not. It seems that you're failing to recognize yourself as the observer in your hypothetical stove burning scenario. It is, I suppose it's you who's saying we should avoid burning yourself on the stove. Even when the hypothetical individual who's being observed, even when they want to put their hand on the stove and feel the pain, it's still you observing the hypothetical situation and saying there's something wrong with this guy. Even if he's masochistic or whatever. When you construct the image in your head, you're a present observer. It absolutely requires an individual in order to decide that something is wrong with the masochist. He might thank us afterwards for curing him of his masochism if he could, but that has no impact on the ontological truth about the subjectivity of judgment. Judgment comes from subject. But you shouldn't find this alarming. You shouldn't find this deranged, and here's why. This ontological truth doesn't have much impact at all on the question of whether you should act on your morality. It's incredible to me how hard I see you fighting this in debates, and I believe it's because you foresee some awful consequence of the truth. But there isn't. We can all go on enforcing our morality as usual. There are certainly some cases where we enforce morality, such as if people are off raping and murdering, we stop them. But anyway, there's no impact. I'll go on to why there aren't consequences in a moment, but actually first I just want to put the last nail in this coffin of an objective opinion or an objective ought. The key is to realize that absolute objectivity is a genuine paradox, much like genuine free will. The objective ought is much like the unmoved mover. If you try to pretend that you're making your own decisions, there's still a reason behind your reasoning that was out of your control, regardless of whether you have all the information necessary to recognize it or the courage to admit it. It's still true. And if you try to pretend you're not present in a hypothetical scenario, you're still there, observing with your own desires and experiences, like it or not, regardless of whether you have the courage to recognize and admit it. But now on to why subjective morality doesn't have consequences. I believe intellectuals avoid this conclusion, that morality is subjective. They've got this strong, motivated reasoning fighting this because they fear that, as a consequence of subjective morality, you can just do whatever you want. Enforcing your own morality would become immoral. We can't stop murderers, can't stop rapers, nothing is wrong. And if a person enjoys masochism, well, let him enjoy it. But that's the great fallacy. It's a fallacy that prevents people from being intellectually honest and open in this discussion. The fact that morality is subjective doesn't mean you shouldn't act on it. Quite the opposite. The fact that you and I and almost everyone else hate murder and rape is good enough for us to act on it. The universe itself doesn't care whether we're raped or murdered. The universe won't prevent it. But we do care, and we will prevent it. Your morality depends on you to act on it. When you realize that your own moral intuitions are in fact a product of you and people like you and depend on you to propagate them, that's empowering, if anything, not morally limiting. I understand that my hatred for intolerance is a subjective thing, and yet I don't feel bad whatsoever about continuing to be intolerant of intolerance. I feel great. After all, the way it became my subjective morality is that I actually believe it. The fact that morality is subjective is just the result of an academic pursuit, without dramatic consequences on how we should conduct ourselves. There might be something to be said about the benefit of realizing others' subjective moral preferences and subjective morality being a basis for empathy, but I'll finish this monologue with the most fun part of all. Let's use your definition of morality as a pursuit of this common utopia, and try to test it with a mental experiment. From here on out, when I say morality, I mean pursuing the alleviation of human suffering, creating the most human happiness, flourishing, etc. So there might be a world in which any human, no matter who they are, would be measurably happiest if they were raised and indoctrinated in that world from birth. Okay, so stick with me here. Spin up every possible combination of human biology, and then simulate a lifetime of existence for all of them in some world with a moral code that they must live by. So let's get a number here. Let's say it would be seemingly endless, but not actually endless, how many combinations of human biology there are. But just to get a number going, let's say 100 trillion or something, it'll serve its purpose. So we've got 100 trillion people being born, all the combinations of biology. And we simulate them with a lifetime of some moral code that we create. And then afterwards, you measure their happiness. And then you run that experiment for every possible combination of moral rules. Again, we're going to have a seemingly endless, but not actually endless number of combinations for morals. So now maybe we've got 100 trillion biological varieties of humans being spawned into existence and brought into this world in which some moral code is enforced on them. And that's done maybe 100 trillion times because we've got 100 trillion different combinations of moral rules. So perhaps in one universe, they all live a lifetime where you're never allowed to kill. In the next universe, they're allowed to kill under special circumstances. The combinations of moral codes, there's tremendous as the biological combinations. But in this pretend experiment, we've got the hardware to simulate all of it. There might be one universe which makes them all the happiest. Maybe. This can't be falsified anyhow. Or perhaps there isn't a universe in which they all agree which universe was ranked number one. There might be merely one universe in which the greatest sum of happiness was had. After each of these experiments, after all 100 trillion people live, you quantify the happiness, measure it, and when you're all done, you can rank all the different universes. But there might be merely one in which the greatest sum of happiness is had, but some individuals in that universe had ranked that one not as number one. So hopefully at this moment you might, at minimum, reserve some scientific uncertainty for the possibility that all 100 trillion humans won't all pick the same existence from 100 trillion existences. I'm asking for a lot of intellectual honesty here and setting aside biases to really consider this. But furthermore, this experiment, it's predicated on unconscious minds being instantiated into these worlds without any biases beyond their biology, just accepting the moral codes they're given. Anyhow, if the undiscovered moral rules of that hypothetical and unknown world is what you'd like to call morality, then yes, that's objective. I think that's what you're driving towards. I don't believe there's such a world that suits all humans who currently exist today or will exist tomorrow. You couldn't construct such a world and a place that all of us now could go into and expect all of us to experience peak happiness. We all have different ideas. Just take me, for example. I'm a secular, anti-religion agnostic with all the same preferences for monogamy and a sort of disgust for polygamy as any typical Bible-thumping religious nut. My moral preferences there have nothing to do with my religious beliefs. It's just exactly what I, as a subject, prefer. I happen to think loyalty in monogamy is a really cool, beautiful thing, and polygamy kind of bums me out. So how do you put me and a sublime polygamist who simply doesn't share my preferences? There's nothing objectively wrong with his way of life. How do you put us in the same moral universe and come out with a consistent rule set? Even if the mental experiment does come out with 100 trillion people agreeing on 1 out of 100 trillion existences, it doesn't seem possible for us to get there with our existing differences built from differing experiences. So anyhow, that last mental experiment is meant to be merely food for thought, but hopefully I made some good points here about symbology, ambiguity, and people accidentally asking the wrong questions or different questions and not realizing that. So anyway, that's all I've got. Thanks for listening.